She stepped off the train expecting one man. She found three. Under her mattress that first night lay a dead man's files, 3 years of evidence her father never lived to use, and a name underlined twice in his own handwriting. Reginald Marsh, the man who had taken everything from her family. He was already here in this territory, moving against the very ranch she had just arrived at. She had come 2,000 miles to start over. She had walked straight into the center of a fight that had already cost her everything once before. And somewhere in the back of her mind, 7 hairpins held a promise she had kept for 7 years, a promise she swore no man in this territory would ever make her break. She was wrong about that last part, but it would take all of this to prove it. This is where her story begins. The train from Sacramento to Elko ran 3 times a week, and on the morning of April 14th, 1879, it carried among its passengers one Eleanor Grace Whitfield, age 22, of Boston, Massachusetts, who had not slept properly in 4 days and was doing a remarkable job of pretending otherwise. She sat with her spine very straight against the hard wooden seat. Her navy blue traveling dress was smoothed carefully over her knees, her leather bag held on her lap with both gloved hands. The Nevada landscape moved past the window with a stark, indifferent grandeur that nothing in her Boston upbringing had prepared her for. There were no green parks here, no elm trees casting pleasant shadows over brick row houses, no carefully tended gardens behind iron fences. There were mountains the color of old bone rising against a sky so enormous and unbroken that looking at it too long made her feel pleasantly untethered from everything she had ever known. She was by any objective measure terrified. She was also, though she considered this carefully before allowing herself the thought, the most free she had felt in 2 years. Her name had been Eleanor Grace Whitfield for 22 years. Daughter of Thomas Whitfield, Boston attorney, and Margaret Ann Whitfield, born Holloway, who had died of what the doctor called a weak heart, and what Eleanor had understood even at 15 to be something closer to a broken one. Her father had been a good man. He had been present, attentive, genuinely devoted in the way of certain decent men of his generation and class, who were entirely capable of loving their wives deeply while remaining almost completely blind to what those wives actually needed. What Margaret Whitfield had needed was simple, though simple does not mean easy. She had needed to be seen. Not admired for her looks, not appreciated for her grace, not complimented on her management of the household. Seen, known, understood in the full complicated truth of herself. It had not happened, not from lack of love, but from a failure of imagination so common in that time and place that it barely registered as failure at all. And Margaret Whitfield, who was intelligent and beautiful and capable of far more than Boston had ever asked of her, had spent 30 years quietly diminishing. And then she had died. Eleanor had been sitting with her when the end came, holding her mother's hand in the stiff white hospital room while the spring rain ran down the window glass. The sound of it was gentle and persistent, the way certain griefs are gentle and persistent, worn smooth by long endurance. Margaret had been unconscious for 2 days, and then quite suddenly she was not. Her eyes opened. The confusion that sometimes accompanies such returns was absent. She looked at Eleanor with the sharp, complete clarity of a woman who has just run out of time for softening anything. Eleanor. Her voice was thin as paper. "I am here, Mama." "Your hair." Her fingers moved toward Eleanor's loose braids. Eleanor leaned down so her mother could reach. Those thin fingers touched the honey blonde plaits with something between grief and fierce tenderness. "You have the most beautiful hair. Do not let them take it down. Mama, you should rest. Listen to me." The pressure from those fingers was surprisingly firm for a woman at the end of her strength. "Keep it up. Wound tight. It is the only armor a woman has in a world run by men who cannot see past our softness. Do not let any man see it loose until he has truly, truly earned the right. Promise me." "I promise," Eleanor said, though she did not fully understand. "You are smarter than your father knows," Margaret said. Her voice was fading now, returning somewhere. "Smarter than anyone here has let you be. Go somewhere, they will see it." She did not speak again. Eleanor had kept the promise. 7 years of tight buns firmly pinned, not a single strand loose in any situation regardless of circumstance. She had kept it through the 2 years of managing their household on increasingly limited means after the creditors began arriving. She had kept it the morning she found Thomas Whitfield, still and cold in his bed, the February light coming gray through the curtains, the cup of tea she had brought him the night before still sitting untouched on the bedside table. She had kept it through the weeks that followed. The lawyers, the creditors, the inventory of everything that had to be sold. And then the arrival of Frederick Holloway, her mother's nephew from Hartford, who offered charity with the gracious manner of a man who wanted everyone in the room to understand what he was sacrificing. The offer was technically generous: a room in his house, help managing his household since his wife was often unwell, the use of the library. Naturally, there would be expectations of appropriate conduct and suitable discretion. He trusted she understood the nature of such arrangements. Eleanor had looked at Frederick Holloway's careful smile and his wife's carefully neutral expression and understood the nature of the arrangement with perfect clarity. She had gone home that evening and read every advertisement in every newspaper her father had collected in the last year of his life. On the third evening, she found a notice placed by the Westward Home Agency of San Francisco seeking genteel young women of good character to correspond with established ranchers and businessmen in the Nevada territory. All arrangements made with full transparency and propriety. References and good faith required on both sides. She had written that same night. 6 weeks later, she received a letter from a Mr. Caleb Quinn of Elko County, Nevada. It was formal and careful and told her very little about the man himself, but a good deal about the land and the work and what he was looking for in a partner. The word partner appeared twice. She noticed that. She wrote back. He wrote again. 4 letters exchanged across 2,000 miles, which was not nearly enough to know a person, but was enough to know 2 things. He used the word partner and appeared to mean it genuinely, and whatever waited in Nevada could not possibly require more courage than staying in Boston under Frederick Holloway's careful charity. She bought her ticket. She packed her 2 permitted trunks. Into the first trunk went her clothes and her father's books, including his well-worn copy of Blackstone's commentaries that she had carried since she was 12 years old. Into the second trunk went the practical items she had carefully researched and acquired in the weeks before departure. And at the very bottom of the second trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, went the stack of papers she had taken from her father's office the morning the creditors arrived. His files on the Silver Crown Mining Company. 3 years of careful documentation that Thomas Whitfield had never had the chance to use. She could not have explained precisely why she took them. Only that they felt important in the way that certain things feel important before you understand why, and she had learned from her father that that feeling deserved to be respected. She pressed the pins deeper into the bun at the back of her skull as the train pulled away from Sacramento. She was 22 years old. She had $40 in her purse and 2 trunks and a dead man's files and a promise to a dead woman. And the Nevada desert was opening up before her, like a question she had not yet learned to answer. She straightened her spine against the wooden seat and watched the mountains come toward her through the train window. She was terrified. She was free. Both of these things were entirely true. The train pulled into Elko at 2 in the afternoon on April 14, 1879. Eleanor Whitfield stepped onto the platform expecting 1 man. She found 3. They stood in a loose formation in the partial shade of the station's overhang, 3 of the largest men she had ever seen occupying the same piece of ground at the same time, and for one disorienting moment she thought there had been some mistake. Perhaps she had stepped into a gathering of some kind. Perhaps her Mr. Quinn was somewhere else in the crowd, and these enormous, weathered, silent men were waiting for someone else entirely. Then the tallest of them stepped forward. He had dark brown hair and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight, and he held his hat in both hands with the formality of a man who had been raised to do that even when it did not come naturally to him. His face was the kind of face that had been shaped by years of weather and outdoor labor, and she suspected by things beyond those, by things that left marks not on the skin, but somewhere deeper and less visible. He was 35 years old. She could see it in the quality of the stillness around him. Not old, but not young either. A man who had been somewhere difficult and had come back carrying whatever he found there. Miss Whitfield. Not a question. A statement delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who verified before he spoke. Mr. Quinn? She took his offered hand. His grip was careful, contained. The hand of a man who was aware of his own strength. These are my brothers. He said it with no particular inflection, as though the information were self-sufficient. The middle brother stepped forward and pulled off his hat with something almost boyish in the gesture. He had auburn hair and warm brown eyes, with the quality of a man who laughed often and knew it, and was not troubled by knowing it. 31 years old, she would learn. His name was Silas. Welcome to Nevada, Miss Whitfield. The journey was not too punishing, I hope. The youngest said nothing. He was 26 and his name was Wade, and he gave Eleanor a single, complete assessing look from her boots to the careful bun at the back of her skull. And whatever he concluded about her, his expression communicated it clearly enough she was going to be a problem. Eleanor looked at Caleb Quinn. The agency letter, she thought, with a clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with calculation, had described one man, one rancher, one bachelor looking for a wife to help manage his household and be a partner in his enterprise. Not three men, not this silent committee standing before her on a Nevada train platform as though she were a piece of livestock being evaluated at auction. She looked at the mountains visible past the station's roof. She thought about the train schedule back to Sacramento. She thought about Frederick Holloway's careful smile. She squared her shoulders. "Shall we go?" she said. The wagon ride to the Quinn Ranch was 14 miles of increasingly rough road through country that was objectively beautiful and subjectively relentless. Nevada did not offer itself gently to new arrivals. It offered itself in its full, uncompromising reality, and if that reality happened to include jaw-rattling ruts and scrub sage that stretched to the horizon in every direction, an afternoon sun that came down like a physical pressure, Nevada was not inclined to apologize for any of it. Silas sat beside Eleanor on the wagon bench and filled those 14 miles with conversation the way a good fire fills a cold room thoroughly generously without making a production of doing it. Caleb drove. Wade rode ahead on a bay gelding, his back straight and his distance deliberate. "Ranch was our father's," Silas said, handing Eleanor his canteen when the dust began to make itself felt in the back of her throat. She accepted it gratefully, and he continued as though she had not interrupted him, which she had not. Patrick Quinn, God rest him, came out from Ohio in the early 50s when the territory was first opening up, built the main house with two other men who eventually moved on. Caleb and Wade and I were all born there. He paused and something shifted briefly in his expression before the warmth returned to it. Our mother Helen, she passed last autumn. She had been after Caleb to find himself a wife for years. Said a ranch without a woman's heart in it was just a barn with furniture. Eleanor filed this away with the methodical care she applied to all information. Caleb had written to the agency to fulfill a dying woman's last wish. Not from longing, not from genuine desire for partnership, or at least not primarily. From duty, from the weight that falls on eldest sons who have made promises they intend to keep. She had known this reading his letters. She had told herself it was entirely acceptable that she herself was not arriving with romantic expectations, that this was a practical arrangement being made by two practical people who needed different things from each other. She told herself this again now, watching the back of Caleb Quinn's dark head and the set of his broad shoulders as he handled the reins with the easy authority of a man entirely at home in this landscape. "How long have you managed the ranch without your mother?" she asked Silas. "Going on a year now. We manage fine. Wade is a natural with the stock. Caleb handles the ledgers and the big decisions. I am better with horses than with anything else in the world." He grinned. "But we have been eating the same 4 meals in rotating order for 12 months, which does get somewhat monotonous after a while." Eleanor thought carefully before she spoke next. There was a line here between honesty and foolishness, and she wanted to find it precisely. "I should tell you," she said, "that I am a reasonable cook, not an exceptional one. What qualifies as reasonable in your estimation? I will not poison anyone. The bread is generally reliable once I have had time to learn a new stove. Soup is a strength of mine. Roasting is acceptable." She paused for one beat. "The agency may have presented my domestic credentials in the most favorable possible light." Silas looked at her. Then he laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the kind that comes from the belly and does not ask permission. "Lord help us," he said, and he sounded genuinely, completely delighted by this information. As the wagon turned through the gate onto Quinland, Eleanor noticed the paper. It was nailed to the gatepost, and she had only a moment as the wagon passed, not enough to read more than the first line and the header above it. But she saw the formal letterhead. She saw the silver gray embossed crest, and she saw three words clearly enough to carry them forward in her memory: Silver Crown Mining Company. She also saw Caleb's jaw go hard. She saw his eyes move to the paper and then deliberately away from it while she was still looking in that direction. When the wagon stopped and everyone was occupied with the business of unloading her trunks, she heard the paper being peeled from the post and the sound of it being folded, and when she glanced over, Caleb was tucking something into the breast pocket of his shirt. He did not mention it. He did not look at her. She said nothing, but she had seen everything, and she did not forget what she saw. The Quinn Ranch was impressive in the way that things built by stubborn, capable men over decades tend to be not elegant, not refined, but solid. The kind of solid that does not bother to announce itself. The main house was 2 stories of well-fitted timber that had been standing long enough to settle into itself the seams between the logs dark and certain. The barn was large and well-maintained. The corrals were properly gated and stoutly constructed. The kitchen garden was overgrown from a year of neglect. There were no curtains on the downstairs windows. There were no flowers anywhere. It was a household without a woman's attention, and that absence was visible in every room she passed through. Mud tracked in and not tracked out again. The kitchen organized by men who were thinking about function and not about the daily pleasure of working in a space. A parlor with a good stone fireplace and comfortable chairs and no small comforts anywhere, none of the 10,000 small touches that transform a house into something a family wants to come home to. She was also, and she registered this separately from everything else standing in a house that was hers to shape if she chose. The strangeness of that thought moved through her like a current. Silas showed her to the room on the second floor. Small, clean, a single wildflower and a cup of water on the windowsill. She knew immediately that this was Silas's doing. It was exactly the kind of small, thoughtful gesture he would make without mentioning it, and exactly the kind of gesture neither of the other two would have thought of. She stood at the window for a moment after he left, looking out at the eastern pasture, where 3 horses moved through the late afternoon light, and she breathed in the smell of sage and dust and horse, and something else she did not have a name for, which might simply have been the smell of a place that was not Boston. She unpicked with a methodical care. The clothes first shaken out and hung or folded, then her father's books stacked on the small shelf above the writing table. Blackstone's commentaries. 3 volumes of case law her father had annotated so thoroughly that the margins were sometimes more text than the page itself. A worn copy of a natural philosophy text she had read 11 times. The practical domestic guide she had purchased in Sacramento from a woman at the bookshop who had pressed it into her hand saying, "Trust me, sweetheart," which she intended to read from the beginning with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. And at the very bottom of the second trunk, the oilcloth packet, she set it on the writing table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she lifted the mattress of the small bed and slid the packet underneath, feeling the faint crackling of the papers settle into place. She let the mattress down again. She smoothed it. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Her hair was tight and correctly wound. Every pin precisely placed her mother's armor in perfect order. She pressed one more pin deeper with her fingertip. Then she went downstairs to make dinner. The first meal was, by any fair and honest accounting, a disaster of considerable magnitude. She had studied the domestic guide on the train from Sacramento and felt reasonably confident in her theoretical grasp of salt beef braised in a Dutch oven. Theory and practice are sometimes close friends and sometimes strangers who have never been properly introduced. And in the kitchen of the Quinn Ranch on that first April evening, they were strangers. The beef came out gray and dense with the quality of something cooked too fast at too high a temperature by someone who had misunderstood the relationship between cast iron and open flame. The biscuits were small and so thoroughly solid that when Wade dropped one experimentally onto his plate, it produced a sound that was more geological than culinary. The gravy was the color of river water after a storm. The potatoes were the single achievement of the meal, because potatoes are forgiving in ways that salt beef and biscuits are not, and Eleanor was grateful for them. Silas ate everything on his plate and worked his way through complimenting each dish with increasing creative desperation that was almost heroic in its sustained effort. "The beef has a very pronounced character," he said at one point, with the expression of a man recalculating in real time. Caleb ate in the careful, methodical way she was already learning to recognize as simply how he did everything without drama and without complaint, consuming what was in front of him, because it was there and because a man who has lived in mountains learns not to waste food regardless of its quality. Wade looked at his plate. He looked at Eleanor. He set down his fork. "The agency said you could cook," he said. It was not said with cruelty. It was said with the flat factual quality of a man stating something that needed to be stated, in a strange way that made it worse than cruelty would have been. Eleanor set down her own fork. She looked at Wade across the table with the precise, unhurried steadiness she had learned from watching her father face hostile witnesses. "The agency," she said, "characterized my domestic skills in the most favorable possible light. They also characterized your brother as a single rancher seeking a wife and omitted entirely to mention that he has two brothers who would be present at every meal for the indefinite future. So we are both navigating a degree of creative advertising from that organization." The silence that followed this statement lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Silas put his face in both hands and made a sound that was definitely laughter, full and unrestrained, his shoulders shaking. Even the corner of Caleb's mouth did something complicated and brief that on a different man's face might have been called the beginning of a smile. Wade looked at Eleanor for another measured moment, then pushed back from the table, carried his plate to the scrap pail with the untroubled manner of a man disposing of evidence, and went outside. "Wonderful," he said flatly as the door closed behind him. Silas lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were wet at the corners. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I believe this is going to be more interesting than any of us anticipated." That night, alone in her room with the lamp turned low, Eleanor opened the domestic guide from page 1 and read it with the careful, systematic attention she applied to legal text. She made notes in the margins. She corrected her misunderstanding of cast iron temperatures. She identified 3 specific errors she had made with the biscuits and 2 with the braised beef. She drew small diagrams of heat distribution in the Dutch oven that would have surprised the guide's original author considerably. She was Thomas Whitfield's daughter. She had never once in her life been beaten by a problem that could be understood through careful study and methodical application. She was not going to be beaten by a Dutch oven. She was absolutely, completely, utterly not going to be beaten by a Dutch oven. The first week built on itself in small victories and careful observations. The second batch of biscuits was edible. The third was genuinely good. By the end of the week, the bread was reliable enough that Silas ate 3 slices in one sitting without performing any particular expression to indicate he was doing it as a kindness, which Eleanor had decided to count as a genuine compliment. She learned that salt beef wanted low heat and a great deal of time, the opposite of what she had attempted on that first evening. She learned that the Dutch oven was better placed over a bed of coals than directly over the open flame. She burned 1 skillet of cornbread and salvaged the second by remembering to use the lid she had not known existed. She also discovered the kitchen garden, which had been left to make its own philosophical statement about the persistence of weeds for the better part of a year. She identified what had originally been planted beneath the determined overgrowth. Beans, squash, turnips, a row of something that might have been carrots surviving through sheer stubbornness. She began clearing around these survivors with the patient, systematic focus she applied to everything that mattered. Wade found her there one morning, crouched in the dirt, with her skirts tucked and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, pulling weeds with the focused energy of someone who has identified an enemy and intends to address the situation completely. He stopped at the garden fence. He appeared to have arrived ready to say something deflating and then seemed to revise this plan when he actually assessed the volume of work she had already accomplished. He stood there for a moment in the stillness of a man revising a conclusion he had already drawn, and then he went away without speaking. She considered this progress of a meaningful kind. The Quinn brothers were 3 distinct men who happened to share blood and a surname and the same wide-shouldered, tall-standing physical inheritance from a father Eleanor had never met. Silas she had understood almost from the beginning. He was the weather system of the ranch, the thing that kept the pressure from building to storm. He had the gift of genuine warmth, the kind that does not need to announce itself, and is therefore more convincing than the kind that does. He was better with horses than he was with anything else in the world, and watching him work with them in the afternoons, she understood why. There was a quality of attention in his hands, a way of being present with the animal in front of him that was both skill and something beyond skill. Wade, she was revising continuously. He was not hostile, she was learning. He was protective. Protection in a man who has learned that showing care is the same as revealing a weakness tends to look like aggression until you understand the mechanics underneath it. Wade Quinn watched the land and the ranch, and every person connected to it, the way certain fathers watch a sleeping child with a ferocity so constant it has become invisible to the person exercising it, simply part of breathing. Every new variable he could not control was a threat to be assessed. She was a new variable. He was assessing her. And Caleb. Caleb Quinn she was beginning to understand a problem of an entirely different nature. Not because he was unkind, he was not. Not because he was unreasonable. He was consistently, almost stubbornly fair in everything he did. He always passed the better chair by the evening fire to her without being asked, as though this were simply logical. The wood box beside the kitchen stove was always full before she noticed it was low, which meant he was doing it at times when she was not there to observe, which meant he was doing it deliberately and without wanting credit for it. When she encountered a difficulty in the household management or the accounts, he answered her questions directly and without condescension, which was a more unusual quality in a man of that time and place than it should have been. But he did not let her see him. He was a house with lights on every ground floor window, and every room upstairs, dark curtains drawn. No invitation offered to wonder what lay behind them. He spoke when spoken to, and he answered what was asked, and he moved through the space they shared with a quietness that was not rudeness, but something else, something more considered, the quietness of a man who has decided that most things are better held than released. On the seventh evening, Caleb came out onto the porch where Eleanor had been reading in the last of the light and stood in the doorway long enough that she became aware of him before he spoke. She had the sense that he was deciding whether to go back inside. He came out instead. He sat in the other porch chair. The first time he had done this voluntarily, the first time he had positioned himself near her without the practical necessity of shared meals requiring it. "You read a great deal," he observed. "My father was a lawyer. His library was my actual education." She kept her finger in the page but looked at him directly. He believed that a woman who could not reason clearly was a woman who would always be at someone else's mercy. "He taught me to think before he taught me much else." "A woman trained in legal thinking," Caleb said. There was something careful in his voice. Not quite judgment, not quite the absence of it. "Does that trouble you?" He was quiet long enough that she understood he was genuinely considering the question, rather than formulating the polite non-answer most men of her acquaintance would have produced. "No," he said, and it sounded like what it was, a true statement. They sat in the cooling air for a while. The Nevada sky was doing what Nevada skies do in the hour after sunset, producing a depth and quantity of stars that the coal smoke and gas lamp sky of Boston had never once managed. Eleanor watched them appear, first one and then several, and then an impossible, overwhelming number, and thought that she could perhaps understand why a person might come to this landscape looking for something they could not find in a city. "You did not know about my brothers," Caleb said, "before you came." "No. I should have included that information in my letters." "Yes, you should have." A pause. "I did not include it because I believed you might decline to come if I did." "I might have." "Are you going to leave?" Eleanor considered the question honestly, which it deserved. She thought about Frederick Holloway's careful smile. She thought about the train schedule back to Sacramento. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "Go somewhere, they will see it," and the quality of the Nevada sky above her, and the solid, unhurried fact of this porch and this ranch and these three improbable men. "I have not decided," she said, which was honest and felt more honest than any reassurance she could have manufactured. Caleb nodded, as though this were the only fair answer, and he recognized it as such. They sat in silence until the cold came down off the mountains and drove them both inside, and Eleanor lay awake in her small room afterward, with her hands pressed against the tight pins in her hair, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. 3 days into the second week, Caleb asked Eleanor to organize the papers on his study desk so he could work through the correspondence backlog. She did. She was thorough because she was always thorough. She sorted and stacked and cross-referenced with the efficiency her father had drilled into her through years of watching him prepare case files. And at the bottom of the pile, not folded, not filed, simply sitting under the weight of everything placed above it, was the paper she had seen on the gatepost. She recognized the silver-gray letterhead immediately. Silver Crown Mining Company. She read it twice. The formal offer was for the Quinn Ranch property in its entirety. The figure name was significant in absolute terms. In terms of what the land and the buildings and the water rights and the pasture and the timber were actually worth, she calculated quickly and with reasonable confidence, based on everything she had observed in 2 weeks, it was approximately one-third of fair market value. Below the formal offer written by hand in a script less careful than the printed text above it, this offer will not be repeated. Men who cannot be reasoned with have a tendency to meet with misfortune in the territory. Consider carefully, Mr. Quinn. Eleanor folded the paper exactly as she had found it. She placed it exactly where it had been in its exact position under the other papers, at the exact same angle. She pressed it flat with her palm. She sat very still for a moment. Her hands were flat on the desktop. Outside, the Quinn Ranch went about its afternoon. Somewhere in the near distance, she could hear Silas working with one of the horses in the near paddock, the rhythm of a man and an animal learning to understand each other. Then she went to the writing table in her room. She wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to Mr. Arthur Pemberton, a San Francisco attorney who had worked alongside her father for many years and maintained a network of professional contacts throughout the Western Territories. The letter asked for everything publicly available about the Silver Crown Mining Company and its principles, with particular attention to documented patterns of property acquisition activity. It was specific, methodical, and composed in the precise language her father had taught her. The second letter was addressed to the Washoe County Recorder's Office. A formal inquiry about recent land transfer registrations and title filings in Elko County. She sealed both envelopes. She placed them in her coat pocket to bring to Elko on the next supply run. That night, she stood before the small mirror above the wash basin and looked at herself for a long moment. The pins in her bun were exactly placed exactly as they always were. Her mother's armor, 7 years worn and perfectly maintained. Whatever is happening with that company, she told herself with a firmness that would have been convincing to anyone listening, is none of my concern. I am here to manage a household and assist with the accounts. That is the arrangement I came into. That is the arrangement I will honor. She pressed one pin deeper, held it there, and then, because she was Thomas Whitfield's daughter and she had never once in 22 years been able to walk away from a legal problem, sitting directly in front of her, she lifted the mattress of the small bed and pulled out the oilcloth packet. She untied the cord. She spread the papers on the writing table in the order her father had arranged them, which was the order that made the legal argument most clearly. She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the washstand. She sat down at the table. She read until 2 in the morning, her lamp burning low, the ranch silent around her, the Nevada stars doing their impossible work outside the window. At the bottom of her father's files in his handwriting, underlined twice with such pressure that the pen had nearly gone through the page. Reginald Marsh, the man behind the company. Find the man and you find the fraud. Eleanor set the paper down very carefully. She looked at that name for a long time. She did not know yet what it meant here in this territory in this particular fight. She did not know if it meant anything at all beyond coincidence. But she wrote the name on a separate sheet of paper, folded it small, and slipped it into the back of Blackstone's commentaries between 2 pages she had memorized years ago. She retied the oilcloth packet. She replaced it under the mattress. She pressed the pins in her hair and held each one for a moment longer than was necessary, feeling the familiar small pressure against her scalp, the familiar anchor of it. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark with the Nevada night settling around her, listening to the sounds of a place that was not yet home, but that she was beginning to know the sound of, and she thought about the name Reginald Marsh, and she thought about her father's handwriting, and she thought about the paper Caleb had folded into his breast pocket at the gate, and she thought about the quality of the silence in this valley, which was not an empty silence, but a full one, the silence of a place that has been here long before anyone arrived and intends to be here long after everyone leaves. She thought about what her mother had said. Go somewhere they will see it. She was beginning to think that wherever she had arrived, it was not a place where she would be allowed to be invisible for very long, even if she wanted to be. She did not sleep well. But when she slept without the kind of fear that had been with her every night since her father died. Some other feeling had taken its place in the hours before dawn. She did not have a name for it yet. It felt something like purpose. 3 months settle into a place the way seasons settle into a landscape, gradually and then completely, until it becomes difficult to imagine the place without what has been added to it. By the middle of July, Eleanor Grace Whitfield had become part of the rhythm of the Quinn Ranch in ways she had not anticipated and had not entirely planned for. The household accounts reorganized under her hand during the second week of May, with a thoroughness that startled even her, were now producing monthly summaries that Caleb reviewed with the expression of a man who has just discovered something unexpected in familiar territory. She had reduced waste in the pantry stores by nearly a fifth simply by implementing the kind of systematic rotation her father had used for his law library. She managed the two remaining ranch hands, Garrett and a quiet, watchful man named Peters, with the same cool practicality she applied to everything. And she had found, as her father had always told her, she would find that men who might have tested a softer woman simply did not bother testing Eleanor Whitfield. There was something in the quality of her attention, in the directness of her assessment, that communicated without words that this was not a woman who would be managed. The kitchen garden was by the end of June genuinely a garden again, rather than a philosophical statement about neglect. She had reclaimed it row by row with the patient, methodical focus of someone who has identified a problem and intends to solve it completely. The beans were climbing, the squash were spreading in the slow, confident way of plants that know they have already won. The possible carrots had revealed themselves definitively as carrots and were progressing with the quiet stubbornness that Eleanor found personally relatable. She had learned to cook, not theoretically as she had known it in Boston, but practically in the real and unforgiving laboratory of a working ranch kitchen where there was no domestic staff to quietly correct errors and no mother to offer guidance and no margin for the kind of elegant failure that polite society permits. She had burned things and oversalted things and produced two further disasters of the kind that the first dinner had been, and she had written notes in the margins of the domestic guide with increasing precision and tried again each time. By the fourth week, Silas had stopped performing appreciation and simply eaten, which she had come to understand was his highest compliment. By the sixth week, Wade had gone back for a second serving of the venison stew, without appearing to notice he had done it, which she counted as a victory of the first order. Silas Quinn, she had understood that almost from the beginning, which was the nature of a certain kind of person. He was the ranch's emotional center of gravity, the thing that kept the pressure between his brothers from building past what any structure could hold. He had the gift of warmth without performance, genuine interest in other people that did not need to announce itself, and was therefore more convincing than the kind that did. He was 31 years old and had been working with horses since he was old enough to stand beside one, and watching him in the afternoons with the animals in his care was like watching something that had found exactly the purpose it was made for and recognized that fact without needing to name it. The thread between Eleanor and Silas formed naturally and without effort. He told her about the land as it changed through the seasons, about the spring flooding that came every year without fail, and the routes the wild horses used coming down from the high country, and the quality of the light in this valley at the end of summer that he had never seen anywhere else. She told him about Boston, not the Boston of privilege and social events she had never particularly cared for, but the Boston of libraries and winter evenings reading beside her father when the money had begun to run thin and staying in was both necessary and in the ways that mattered most entirely sufficient. Two people from entirely different worlds finding a shared language in the appreciation of things that require genuine attention to understand. Wade she was revising continuously and found that each revision brought her closer to something she had not expected to find there. He was not hostile. She had been wrong to read it that way in the beginning, and she acknowledged this privately with the honesty she required of herself in all things. He was protective, fiercely, constantly, almost involuntarily protective, the way certain men become when everything they love has been compressed into one piece of land and one family, and the world has already demonstrated that it intends to take things from you if you let it. Patrick Quinn had built that ranch from raw territory. Helen Quinn had given 30 years of herself to making it a home. Both of them were gone now, and what remained was the ranch and the three sons who had grown up inside it, and Wade Quinn watched all of it with the ferocity of someone standing guard over the last thing that cannot be replaced. Every new variable was therefore a threat to be measured. Eleanor was a new variable. He was measuring her. The morning she cleared the last of the weeds from the garden's eastern bed and stood back to assess the work, dusty and pleased with herself in the uncomplicated way that comes from physical labor toil. Completed well, Wade appeared at the fence. He had clearly arrived with something dismissive prepared. Then he looked at what she had actually done. The prepared dismissal did not emerge. He stood there for a moment in the stillness of a man revising a conclusion he had already drawn, and then he went away without speaking. The following morning, a better garden tool appeared at the corner of the eastern bed. Her old one had a cracked handle she had been managing around. The new one was well balanced and properly weighted and showed the marks of having been recently cleaned and oiled. There was no note. There was no explanation. Eleanor used the new tool and said nothing about it to anyone. She considered it a language worth learning to speak. And then there was Caleb. Caleb Quinn was a problem of a different nature than his brothers, and Eleanor had come to understand this fully enough by mid-June to stop pretending she did not find him genuinely difficult to account for. He was not unkind. He was not withholding in the petty way of men who use silence as punishment or distance as demonstration of power. He was fair in everything consistently and almost stubbornly so. He answered her questions directly. He treated her observations with the kind of genuine consideration that she had encountered in her life from her father and from almost no one else. He left the better chair by the fire. The wood box was always full before she noticed it was low. On the two occasions when she had encountered men in Elko who had tried to overcharge her or dismiss her information as unreliable, Caleb had said nothing and done nothing, and she had managed both situations herself entirely, and he had not once expressed surprise that she had done so. But he did not let her see him. He was a house with every ground floor window lit and every room upstairs dark and the curtains carefully drawn, and no signal offered that a person might wonder what was behind them. He spoke when addressed and answered what was asked and moved through the shared space of the ranch with a quietness that was not coldness, but something more deliberate than coldness. The quietness of a man who has been holding things for so long that holding them has become simply how he exists. Eleanor told herself with the regularity of someone who suspects they are not being entirely convincing, even to themselves, that she was not particularly interested in what was behind those drawn curtains. This was her 7th or 8th time telling herself this. She was becoming aware that repetition was not making the statement more persuasive. One evening in late June, after the supper dishes were washed and the other two brothers had gone their separate ways into the evening, Caleb came into the kitchen with his empty plate, which he did not have to do and would not normally have done, and set it by the wash basin. And then instead of leaving, he picked up the drying cloth and began working through the stack of dishes she had already cleaned. She looked at him. He looked at the dishes. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. They worked in silence for several minutes, and Eleanor was aware of something strange happening in the center of her chest, a kind of tightness that was not quite discomfort and not quite anything she had a better name for. The kitchen was warm. The lamp cast an amber circle that included both of them and excluded everything else. "Why are you still here?" she asked finally. "And I do not mean in the kitchen. I mean here, on this ranch, in this valley." She paused, deciding to say the true thing rather than the careful thing. "Mountain men usually move. They go back to the high country. You came back from the mountains and stayed." Caleb was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with careful attention. "I had been alone up in the high country for 3 years," he said. "Trapping. Living rough. It was good for a while. Quiet. Simple. A man can be alone that long and it serves a purpose." Another pause longer. "But a man can also be alone past the point where it serves a purpose. Past the point where it is chosen rather than simply continued. I came back to sell furs and intended to stay a few days." He looked at her then directly with the full quality of his attention that she had come to understand was not something he gave casually. "And then I met you." Eleanor's hands went still in the dishwater. "What does that mean?" she said. Carefully. "It means you are the first person in 3 years who looked at me and did not see a curiosity or a problem to be managed. You treated me like a man who needed a room, that was all. It was enough." He set down the dry plate. "So I stayed." She did not know what to do with that. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron, buying herself the time that small actions can purchase when larger responses have not yet formed. I treat everyone the same, she said. I know, he said. That is why it meant something. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and found him looking back with those steady amber eyes. She was learning to read the quality of a man who sees more than he says and says only what he means. She felt suddenly as though she were standing in a room she had walked into without noticing the door. I should finish up here, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. Good night, Eleanor, he said. He used her given name rarely enough that hearing it produced a response she had not prepared, for something between surprise and recognition, as though he had said something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting for it. She nodded without quite trusting her voice and listened to his footsteps on the stairs. That night she lay in the dark with her fingers against the pins in her hair and thought about her mother and about Caleb Quinn and about the drawn curtains and what might or might not be behind them. She pressed the pins deeper, the familiar small anchor of it. She had made a promise. The promise still stood. She left her hair up, but for the first time since Boston, it took her a while to remember why. The letter from Arthur Pemberton arrived on a Tuesday morning in the middle of July, carried on the twice-weekly mail wagon from Elko. Eleanor collected this mail as a matter of course, one of her small organizational efficiencies, and she knew from the San Francisco postmark and the careful, formal handwriting what this particular envelope contained before she broke the seal. She opened it in her room with the door closed. Pemberton was a thorough man. He had always been thorough. It was the quality her father had most respected in him, and it was evident in the 6 pages of close-written notes he had compiled using his contacts across 3 states and 2 territories. He had found exactly what Eleanor had asked for. Reginald Marsh, 51 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, operating now out of San Francisco, where he maintained offices on Montgomery Street and a reputation for aggressive acquisition practices in the Western Territories. The Silver Crown Mining Company was one of 4 holding entities under his control, each engaged in resource extraction or land development in different regions of the West. His operational pattern, documented across every available case, was consistent to the point of being almost mechanical in its repetition. He identified land with resource potential. He made a below-market offer. When refused, he began manufacturing legal pressure, typically through challenges to title validity or claims of prior rights. When legal pressure proved insufficient, he moved to economic harassment, supply disruptions, rumor campaigns, pressure on workers and suppliers. When economic harassment proved insufficient, he escalated to physical intimidation. He had done this in California in 1872. He had done it in Oregon in 1874. He had done it in Utah Territory in 1876. In California in 1872, the attorney who had been building a case against him on behalf of a farming family whose water rights Marsh had attempted to seize was a man named Thomas Whitfield of Boston. Marsh had used his financial connections to call in Whitfield's professional debts, simultaneously effectively destroying his law practice, and in the process discrediting the evidence Whitfield had spent nearly 3 years assembling. The farming family lost their case. Thomas Whitfield lost everything and never fully recovered what he had lost. Eleanor put down the letter. She sat on the edge of the small bed in her room at the Quinn Ranch and looked at the wall opposite her, which was plain timber, and told her nothing, and she breathed very carefully for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Silas working with the horses in the near paddock. The sound was rhythmic and familiar. The smell of the ranch came through the window, sage and dust, and the warmth of high summer in Nevada. She thought about her father, not the way she usually thought about him, with the mixture of love and grief and the specific kind of sorrow that comes from watching someone diminish slowly. She thought about him as she had seen him in his last year, moving through the rooms of their Boston house, with the quality of a man carrying something that had no name he was willing to speak aloud. She thought about his files assembled over 3 years with such care. She thought about the morning she found him and the absolute silence of the room. She thought about Reginald Marsh. She folded Pemberton's letter into the oilcloth packet with her father's files. She smoothed her skirt. She stood. She went downstairs and found Caleb in his study and knocked on the open door. "I need to speak with you," she said, "about the Silver Crown Mining Company and about what I know about them." She told him most of it. She told him about the company's documented pattern, about the progression from offer to legal pressure, to economic harassment, to physical intimidation, about the specific sequence of events she expected to follow based on what had happened in California and Oregon. She laid it out methodically and without drama, the way her father had taught her to present a legal argument. Start with what is provable, build to what is probable, and let the logic carry the weight. She did not tell him about her father, not yet. She needed to understand how he received what she was offering before she gave him the part of it that was personal and raw, and that would tell him more about her than she was yet certain she wanted him to know. Caleb listened without moving. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the wind working its way around the corner of the house. "How long have you known this?" he said. "I suspected from the first week. I have been building confirmation since then." "Call my brothers in," he said. She repeated it for all three of them. The three Quinn brothers stood or sat around the kitchen table in the July heat and listened to Eleanor Whitfield lay out the Silver Crown Mining Company's operating methodology with the precision of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 3 months, and the room was very quiet when she finished. Wade looked at her for a long measuring moment. "You have been investigating Silver Crown from our kitchen table," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was something more complicated than an accusation. "From your kitchen table, your study of the Elko Public Records Office and through correspondence with attorneys in 3 cities, Eleanor said. "Yes." Silas was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something beyond the easy warmth that was his habitual face, something that looked very much like reassessment. "You are considerably more than you appeared to be," he said. "I am exactly what I am," Eleanor said. "I did not conceal anything." No one asked. Wade looked at her for another moment with the expression she was beginning to read, as the face he wore when a fact was inconveniently overturning something he had already concluded. Then he looked at his oldest brother. "She is right," Caleb said. He was still looking at Eleanor, and the quality of his attention had shifted in a way that was difficult to categorize, and that she felt in a part of herself she had not been expecting to involve in this conversation. "We need to talk about what we do next." What came next was a summer that tightened like a fist closing, slow and incremental and relentless. The south pasture fence went first. Cut clean through in the night, a section of 40 yards professionally done, 15 cattle scattered into the rocky terrain to the east. Caleb and Wade and Garrett spent 3 days recovering them. It was expensive in time and labor, in the grinding way that separates sustained harassment from a single dramatic event. A single dramatic event a person can respond to with anger and resolution. Sustained harassment wears at something deeper and slower, and the people behind it know that. The south well went next. Kerosene, a rag soaked and dropped in the work of 5 minutes that produced 2 days of unavailable water in a cleaning process that was both expensive and exhausting. Eleanor wrote it down in the log she had started keeping, dates, specifics, estimated costs in time and labor and money. Evidence assembled the way her father had taught her to assemble it, one documented fact at a time. Then the rumors began in Elko. The Quinn Ranch was in financial difficulty. There were unresolved legal complications with the property title. Investing labor or materials with the Quinns was inadvisable. The source of these rumors was diffuse and apparently spontaneous, which was exactly how such campaigns were designed to appear. Eleanor spent 2 weeks in careful conversation with the right people in the right places, the kind of conversations her father had taught her to have, listening more than speaking, and noting what was not said and as carefully as what was. She traced the source to a dry goods merchant in Elko named Clement Hatch, who was, she determined through several indirect lines of inquiry, receiving payments from a San Francisco account that traced to Silver Crown Holdings. She brought this to the dinner table on a Wednesday evening and watched Wade's face move through fury to cold calculation to something that looked almost like a reluctant, suppressed satisfaction. "You are spying on our behalf," he said. "I am gathering information," she said. "It is not spying when you are doing it for the side that is being wronged." Silas raised his coffee cup toward her in a small, precise salute. "Whatever the correct word for it is," he said, "it is excellent. Please continue." Two ranch hands gave notice in the same week of August, citing concerns about the ranch's stability that had clearly originated in the same manufactured rumor campaign Eleanor had already documented. Garrett stayed. Peter stayed. The ranch was down to a lean operation running on the labor of three brothers and one remaining hand, and Silver Crown had not yet made its most dangerous move. That move came on a Thursday morning in the second week of August in the near paddock, with a firecracker tied to a fence post in the shadow of the post, where it was invisible until it was too late. Silas had been working a young horse, a bay 3-year-old, with the combination of intelligence and inexperience that makes a horse difficult in exactly the most unpredictable ways. Eleanor had come out to watch, as she sometimes did in the afternoons, because watching Silas work with a difficult horse was like watching something that had found its exact purpose and knew it without needing to be told. The firecracker went off with a sharp, flat crack that split the afternoon in two. The bay went sideways and then up with all the speed and power that fear produces in an animal that does not yet know what to do with its own strength. Silas came off the left side. He landed with his shoulder hitting the fence rail and his body following through in a way that told Eleanor, watching from 20 yards away, exactly what had happened before she had finished covering the distance between herself and him. She reached him first. Silas. She was already on her knees in the dirt beside him, not worrying about the dress, not worrying about anything except the assessment. Can you hear me? Currently hearing nothing except a sincere wish that I had not gotten on that horse this morning, he said, and the fact that he could produce a complete sentence with something resembling his normal cadence was useful information. Left shoulder. Yes. She ran through the assessment her father's medical reference had described, and she had read twice since arriving at the ranch. Ribs, the impact had caught two of them, but the absence of any bubbling or catching in his breathing meant no puncture. Shoulder, the distinctive drop and forward displacement of a dislocated joint was unmistakable. It has happened before, Silas said, and he was going carefully pale in the controlled way of a man who has decided that maintaining composure is currently the only available form of dignity. You know the reduction. She had watched the ranch doctor perform a shoulder reduction once on a hand who had been thrown the previous autumn, and she had made the doctor explain the mechanical principles of what he was doing in terms she could understand and remember. She had read about it twice more since coming to Nevada. She had, as it happened, hoped very much never to need this particular piece of knowledge. Yes, she said, it will hurt for approximately 10 seconds. More than this, considerably, for approximately 10 seconds. She took the leather strap from the fence post nearest to hand. Silas bit down on it without being asked to. She talked him through each step in the quiet, level voice of someone who has learned that calm, delivered steadily, is its own form of relief, that the voice telling a person what is happening matters nearly as much as what is actually happening. The first attempt failed. The second attempt failed. On the third attempt, with her knee used as the necessary point of counterpressure, and the angle of approach adjusted precisely, the joint returned to its socket with a sound that made her close her eyes for one involuntary half-second, and that produced in Silas a full-body flinch he clearly considered an acceptable compromise between response and control. He lay flat in the paddock dirt for a long moment, breathing, letting the acute peak of it pass. Then he turned his head and looked at her with his eyes still slightly unfocused from the pain and an expression underneath the pain that she had not seen on him before. You, he said, his voice rough, are not what any of us expected. No one ever is, she said. She was shaking slightly in her hands, which she was glad he could probably not see. Let us get you inside. And when Caleb returned that evening and found Silas in bed with his shoulder properly strapped and two cracked ribs wrapped and Eleanor's written report of the day's events waiting on the table beside him, because she had known she would not be able to deliver the report verbally without her voice betraying the residual fear she had not yet entirely processed, she watched him read it. She watched him read it twice. She watched the deep, particular stillness that settled over him, that she now recognized as the most serious version of his self-containment, the version that only appeared when something had genuinely frightened him. He looked up from the paper. The firecracker, he said. Yes. Which means someone was on our land. Someone who knew Silas's schedule for that horse on that morning. Yes, and the number of people who knew that schedule is small. She kept her voice steady. I have been thinking about who specifically would have had that information. And she told him about Peters. She had done the calculation carefully and without wanting to be right about it. Peters worked the South Range, and the brothers rotated their schedule through it on a pattern that Peters would have observed over 2 years. Peters was the only person outside the family who would have known that Silas planned to work the Bay 3-year-old that particular morning because Peters had been present 3 days before when the schedule was discussed over a morning meal and the arrangement was made. Caleb confronted Peters the following morning. Wade stood in the barn doorway. Eleanor was in the kitchen and could hear through the window she had left deliberately cracked the quality of the conversation, if not its content. She heard the shift in Peter's voice when whatever line he had been maintaining gave way. The sound a man makes when he has been telling himself for months that what he is doing is small and harmless, and has just been made to understand that it has never been either. Peter's wife was ill. The medical bills were real. Silver Crown had approached him with what had seemed at the time like simple questions, like harmless information, like nothing that could hurt anyone. Caleb gave him a month's wages and told him to go. Wade came into the kitchen afterward with the tight, barely contained energy of a man who has decided not to say what he is thinking and is finding the decision expensive. He paid him, Wade said to no particular listener. After what that man did, Caleb paid him out and let him walk. He has a sick wife, Eleanor said. He got Silas hurt. Yes, and he has a sick wife. She looked at Wade directly. Caleb can hold both of those things at the same time. That is not weakness. That is precision. Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the expression she was learning to read as the face he wore when something had arrived that he had not anticipated and was not yet certain what to do with. Then he went back outside without answering. But the following morning, she found him at the kitchen garden fence before breakfast, looking at the bean rows with what might on another man have been called careful attention. He did not offer a compliment. He did not offer conversation. He simply looked, and then he went to start the day's work, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway watching him go and thought that she was beginning to understand the language of Wade Quinn and that it was worth the effort of learning. 3 weeks after Silas was hurt, recovering with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who has been broken before and understands the mechanics of mending, Caleb asked Eleanor one evening if she would walk with him along the eastern fence line. They went out in the hour before full dark, when the Nevada sky was doing the thing it did at that hour, layering color on color from the horizon up in a way that painters from the east spent careers attempting to approximate and never quite managed. They walked in the near silence that had become without either of them designating it as such a kind of language between them. The silence of people who have discovered that they do not need to fill space in order to be comfortable sharing it. You have not told me all of it, Caleb said. The mountains were going dark at their bases and still lit at their peaks. Eleanor looked at them. No, she said. Tell me. So she did. Reginald Marsh, her father. The California water rights case that Thomas Whitfield had been building when Marsh used his financial connections to destroy him. The 3 years of files that had found their way into her traveling bag alongside Blackstone's commentaries. The Westward Home Agency advertisement that she had found in her father's papers in the stack of newspapers from the Nevada territory that he had been collecting in the year before he died, possibly because he had been tracking Marsh's movement west, and possibly simply because he read everything and kept everything. The way she had chosen Nevada with full awareness of what she might find there. I did not know with certainty that it was Marsh, she said, when I arrived. The pieces suggested it. When Pemberton's letter confirmed it, I understood what I had walked into. She paused. I chose to stay, not solely because I had no alternative, because this is my fight as much as yours. He destroyed my father as surely as if he had used a weapon. He simply used a different instrument. Caleb was quiet for a long time. The last light was leaving the higher peaks. The first stars were beginning to appear. You have been carrying this alone, he said. I am accustomed to carrying things alone. You are here, he said. You do not have to be accustomed to it here. She looked at him in the near dark, and she said because she wanted to understand rather than deflect. Tell me something true, something you have not told anyone. He looked at the mountains for a long moment. She could feel him deciding. I was 19 when I enlisted, he said. The Civil War had been running 2 years. I went because it seemed like the thing a man did. I was 21 when it ended. A pause. I did not come home. I re-enlisted for the campaigns in the territories, what they called the Indian Wars. I was 23 when I finally left the army. He stopped. Eleanor waited. My unit received orders one night near a river crossing in Wyoming territory, he said. The quality of his voice had not changed. It was still the same measured, quiet sound she had learned to listen for. But there was something in it now, something that had weight. We were told we were destroying an enemy supply depot. We moved on it after dark. We did not know until we were inside the perimeter that it was not a supply depot. Another pause. There were 7 people inside, mostly old, a woman. None of them were combatants. None of them were armed. He breathed. I was the one who had received the order. He did not say anything else. Eleanor did not reach immediately for comfort or absolution because her father had taught her that the worst thing you can do with a genuine confession is try immediately to ease the weight of it, because that tells the person confessing that you cannot actually hold what they have said. She stood beside Caleb Quinn in the Nevada dark and held what he had said for a proper moment before she spoke. You have been carrying that for over a decade, she said. Yes. And then you went into the mountains. 3 years, I thought I would either find a way to live with it or I would not come back. A long pause. I found that making peace with something you cannot undo is not a thing that happens once. It is something you do every day, differently some days than others. He looked at her then. My mother used to say that carrying a thing honestly is the beginning of wisdom, that demanding peace with an unpeaceable fact is its own kind of arrogance. Eleanor turned this over carefully, and she was right, she said. She was almost always right. Then honoring her by building something new was the right kind of tribute, Eleanor said, even if the method was somewhat indirect. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, the architecture of one. You wear your hair up, he said. The shift was so sudden she blinked. What? Every day since you arrived. The same way. Even the mornings you are the first one down before anyone could possibly see. Her hand moved to the back of her skull without her deciding to move it. She felt the familiar pins, the familiar tightness. She realized she had been pressing them deeper in the last several minutes without noticing. She told him about her mother. She told him about the hospital room and the rain on the window and the thin, strong pressure of dying fingers against her braids. She told him about the promise and the 7 years of pins and what the pins meant, what they had always meant, that the world was hard on soft women, and her mother had needed her daughter to survive it. Caleb listened with the full quality of his attention, which was not a small thing to receive from a man who gave it carefully. It sounds, he said, choosing each word with the same precision he applied to everything, as though she was protecting you the only way she had available to her. Yes, but you are not her, he said quietly, and this is not her life. The words arrived in a place she had been deliberately not examining for 7 years. She felt them land. She felt them settle into that space in the chest where things land when they are true and unwelcome, and also somehow necessary. She did not let her hair down, but her hands dropped from the back of her head, and she became aware with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable that she had been pressing the pins deeper for several minutes, which was what she always did when she was afraid of something she could not quite name. Good night, Mr. Quinn, she said. Caleb, he said. The stars were very bright. The mountains were dark. The ranch was visible in the near distance, its windows lit. Good night, Caleb, she said. She walked back alone through the warm Nevada evening, and she did not touch the pins in her hair for the rest of that night, which was for Eleanor Grace Whitfield, something very close to a revolution. She did not sleep well, but when she finally slept, she was not afraid of anything specific. And in the morning she came down to the kitchen and built the fire and started the bread and looked out the window at the Quinn Ranch settling into its day, and she thought, I am not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, I am not going anywhere. She had not known that with certainty until this moment. Now she did. It settled into her like bread settling into its rise, quiet and certain, and producing something that would only become apparent when time had done its necessary work. October came to the Quinn Ranch with the temper of a Nevada autumn, which is not the soft, melancholy descent of eastern autumns, but something more abrupt and more honest. The mornings arrived sharp-edged and cold. The days were brief and brilliant, burning through their light quickly as though aware of the shortage. The evenings carried that high country quality, that painters traveled west to find and almost never managed to capture a warmth of color that had nothing to do with temperature, the mountains going amber and rose, and finally the deep purple of old bruises before the dark came down. The aspen groves on the lower slopes had turned. The horses were growing their winter coats. The kitchen smelled of preserving and baking, and the accumulated evidence of a household that had learned over the course of one long summer to feed itself with genuine competence and occasional pride. Eleanor Grace Whitfield had been at the Quinn Ranch for 6 months. She did not think about Boston with the frequency she once had. Boston had become the kind of place you think about the way you think about a country you once visited. Real remembered, no longer yours in any way that matters. She thought about her mother with a regularity that had changed in quality over those months, moving from grief towards something more like gratitude for the promise, for the 7 years of pins, for the armor that had kept her hard enough to survive the years after her father's death, and arrive at this particular valley in this particular season intact enough to be useful. She thought about Reginald Marsh with a focused, cold clarity that had no softness in it anywhere, which was appropriate because Marsh deserved none. And she thought about Caleb Quinn at various hours and in various contexts, and had stopped sometime in September, pretending that she did not. The letter from Edgar Pierce arrived on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October, carried on the mail wagon from Elko. The return address was her father's former law partner in Boston, and the handwriting was the careful, formal penmanship of a man who had been writing legal correspondence for 30 years and had strong opinions about how it should be done. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table before anyone else came down for breakfast in the gray early light, with her coffee going cold beside her. Pierce wrote to inform her of a development she might not yet be aware of. Her father's outstanding debts, all of them, had been satisfied in full. The creditors had been paid, and the matter was closed. The source of the settlement had been arranged through a San Francisco bank with a note requesting complete anonymity, and Pierce had been unable to determine who had made the payment. He thought she should know, as it affected her legal and financial position considerably. As of the date of his writing, she was free of all obligation. Eleanor read this 3 times. Then she folded the letter with precise, unhurried movements and placed it in the pocket of her apron. She was free, technically completely, with no remaining financial compulsion holding her to any arrangement she had entered. If she chose to write to the Westward Home Agency and withdraw from the agreement that had brought her to Nevada, she could do that. If she chose to take her accumulated household allowance and purchase a train ticket east, she could do that too. She could teach school. She could approach a law firm in San Francisco about a research position. Arthur Pemberton had connections enough to open that door. She had credentials enough to walk through it. She had options, real ones. Options she had not possessed 6 months ago when she stepped off the train at Elko with $40 and 2 trunks and a dead man's files. She set down her coffee. She stood. She walked out of the kitchen and across the yard and into the barn, where she found Caleb exactly where she had known she would find him, working on the harness repairs that had been needed since August, his large, scarred hands moving through the leather with the patient, methodical precision that she now understood as simply the way he inhabited every task that mattered to him. He did not look up when she came in. He always seemed to know it was her. She had noticed this some weeks ago and had decided not to examine it too closely. "Who paid my father's debts?" she said. He set down the awl. "Where did you learn about that?" he said, which was not a denial, and both of them knew it. "Caleb." She said his name with the quality she had developed for it, the quality that meant, do not manage this situation, do not find the diplomatic angle, simply answer the question I am asking. He looked at her. His jaw was set in the way it took when he was prepared to hold a position he expected to be challenged. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "You sold the horses." She had worked this out during the walk across the yard, the pieces assembling themselves with the cold efficiency of a mind trained to find connections. The 3 prize ones, the breeding pair and the gray stallion. "They have been gone since August, and you told me you had traded them for winter supplies, and I believed you because you are generally honest, and I was not asking the right questions. They brought a fair price. You did not have the right to do this without telling me." "If I had told you," he said, and there was something in his voice now, something urgent underneath the steadiness that she rarely heard from him, "you would have refused." "Yes, because it was my father's debt. It was his failure and his loss in the shape of what his life had become, and it was mine to carry or to release on my own terms in my own time. It was a burden you did not earn. His voice was still quiet, but the urgency in it was undisguised now. You came here because you had no alternative. That is not the same as choosing to be here. I want you to stay because you have alternatives and you choose this anyway. He looked at her directly with that steady gaze she had spent months learning to read. Do you understand the difference? Eleanor stood in the barn doorway with the October light behind her and looked at this man who had sold 3 years of careful breeding stock to give her the freedom to leave, and felt something in the center of her chest do something she had not asked it to do and could not precisely characterize. You want me to have a choice, she said. I want you to have a choice, he said, because if you stay, I want it to mean something. I want it to be real. He set down the harness leather. His hands were very still. And if you go, I will wish you well and I will mean it. But I needed you to be able to go, Eleanor. I needed that to be real too. She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet barn with the horses moving softly in their stalls and the smell of hay and leather and honest work surrounding them both. I am not leaving, she said. He did not move. I am not leaving, she said again, and her voice was steadier the second time, the way a thing becomes steadier when you hear yourself say it and recognize it as the truth you have known for some time without having spoken it. Not because I have nowhere to go. You were apparently quite determined to ensure that I had somewhere to go. I'm not leaving because I do not want to. She breathed. This valley, this ranch, the garden I have been fighting weeds in since May. Silas and his horses, and the way he fills a room with something that makes it easier to be in. Wade in his silences that I have been learning to read like a language. She paused and then said the true thing because there was no longer a reason not to. And you. I do not want to be anywhere you are not, which is entirely your fault, and I am fairly angry about it, and I am staying. Something happened in Caleb Quinn's face that she had not seen before. It moved through him like weather, like a front, coming through, changing the quality of the light. Not quite a smile, the full architecture of one present and completely real. I will bear the anger, he said. You had better, she said. I hold things for a long time. 3 weeks after that morning in the barn, Silver Crown Mining Company made its final and most dangerous move, and it arrived not as violence but as law, which Eleanor had told the brothers was always the more dangerous form. The notice came from the Elko Territorial Court. Silver Crown had filed a formal petition asserting that the Quinn Ranch property had been improperly conveyed under the original land grant, that the mineral rights had never been legally transferred, and that the Quinn title was therefore in active dispute. A hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks hence. The petition was 60 pages long, formally constructed, and referenced documentary evidence that had the quality of things carefully assembled over time by people who know what they are doing. Caleb read it in the stillness that she now knew was his deepest register, the one that only appeared when something had genuinely unsettled him. He handed it to Eleanor without speaking. She read it once quickly with the practiced eye her father had spent years developing in her. Then she read it again more slowly, noting specific language, specific references, the structure of the argument being constructed. Then she looked up. I need your study, she said. Every original title document in your possession. The full chain back to the original land grant. And time. How much time? As much as it takes. She worked at Caleb's study desk for 4 days without stopping, except to sleep briefly and eat what the brothers brought her without comment or question. Silas read her notes back to her when she asked him to, his voice patient and careful, and entirely without impatience regardless of the hour. Wade brought coffee on the second morning without being asked, and on the third afternoon moved the lamp to a better position with such quiet efficiency that she did not register the improvement until she had been benefiting from it for an hour. Caleb came morning and evening and asked what she needed and then went to find it and did not ask questions she had not yet answered. On the fourth day, she found it. Silver Crown's petition rested on a chain of title that included, at a critical point, a deed of transfer dated 1871. This deed purported to convey the original mineral rights from the first land grant holder to a predecessor company that had subsequently been absorbed into Silver Crown. The deed was formally presented, correctly formatted, stamped with the seal of the Washoe County Recorder's Office, and notarized by a man named James Holbrook. Eleanor had been writing to the Washoe County Recorder's office for 8 weeks, one carefully specific inquiry at a time, building a picture from the available public record in the methodical way her father had taught her. Verify each fact before proceeding to the next. Never theorize past what you can document. The recorder's office had been helpful. The records they maintained were complete. James Holbrook had died in August of 1869. 18 months before, the deed bearing his notary seal and his signature had, according to the document Silver Crown was submitting to the territorial court, been executed and witnessed. Eleanor sat very still at Caleb's study desk for a long time after she understood what she was looking at. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the Quinn Ranch was going about its evening in the ordinary sounds of a working place settling toward dark. She thought about her father at his desk in Boston, following this same thread in California in 1875 and 1876. She thought about the 3 years of files he had assembled in the morning she had found him in the silence of the room. She thought about Reginald Marsh's name written in her father's handwriting and underlined twice. She picked up the deed of transfer. She picked up the Washoe County correspondence. She picked up the 3 parallel case files from California and Oregon that Pemberton had sent her months ago, in which she had noted at the time that the forged notarial seals used in those states had borne the same structural characteristics as each other, the same specific pattern of alteration. She opened her father's oilcloth packet for the first time in weeks and laid his original California documentation alongside what she had assembled for Nevada. The seals were the same, not similar. The same forger, the same technique, the same specific set of alterations to a legitimately obtained notarial stamp applied to fraudulent documents across 3 states and now 1 territory over a period of nearly a decade. Her father had seen this. He had seen all of it. He had been 3 months from being able to prove it when Marsh had destroyed him. She gathered everything into its proper order. She stood. She went to find the brothers. She spread the documents across the kitchen table, and all 3 of them leaned over them while she explained with care and precision and without drama what she had found. The fraudulent deed, the dead notary, the 18-month impossibility, the identical pattern across California and Oregon, and now Nevada. 3 states, 1 forger, 1 company, 1 man directing it all. If we prove the forgery here, she said, and present the California and Oregon evidence alongside it, we do not simply win the Quinn title dispute. We give the Territorial Prosecutor's Office grounds to investigate every property transaction Silver Crown has conducted in this region. We end Marsh's ability to operate in this territory. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas said, "You have had pieces of this for months." "I have been building the evidence base for months," Eleanor said. "A theory without documentation is only an accusation. My father knew that. He taught me that." Caleb looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight. "Can you present this at the hearing?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once with the same quality he brought to every decision that mattered to him, complete and final, no part of it held back. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in November in the territorial courtroom at Elko, before a judge named Whitmore, who had a reputation for patience and a longer reputation for deciding cases on the evidence rather than on the prestige or the expense of the attorneys presenting it. Marsh's legal representation arrived from San Francisco. 3 attorneys in well-tailored coats who carry themselves with the specific confidence of men who have won this way before and expect to win this way again. They presented their case with the smooth, practiced efficiency of people working from a blueprint that has succeeded in the past. The language was precise. The documentation was voluminous. The argument was designed to overwhelm through sheer mass. Eleanor was not an admitted attorney. She identified herself to the court accurately as the Quinn family's legal representative and property researcher. Judge Whitmore regarded her over the rims of his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has seen most things in the course of a long career on the territorial bench and found this only moderately unusual. He did not object. He waited for her to begin. She presented the case in the order her father had taught her: what is undeniable first, then what is documented, then what the documented facts compel any reasonable person to conclude. She did not rush. She did not perform. She spoke with the clarity of someone who has spent months understanding every dimension of what she is saying and has nothing to prove except the truth of it. The Quinn chain of title first. Clear, unbroken, properly documented from the original land grant through every subsequent transaction to the present day. Then the Silver Crown petition addressed point by point, each assertion examined against the documentary record. Then the 1871 deed of transfer on which Silver Crown's entire argument rested, its specific language, its specific claims, the notarial seal and signature of James Holbrook, then the Washoe County Recorder's records, then the death certificate, then the timeline stated simply and clearly, James Holbrook died in August of 1869. The deed bearing his seal was dated November of 1871. These two facts could not both be true. One of them was not. The courtroom was very quiet. Then the California files, then Oregon. The same seal characteristics, the same forger. 3 states, 1 pattern, 1 company, 1 man. Then she opened her father's packet for the last time. She laid Thomas Whitfield's original California documentation on the clerk's table. 3 years of careful work by a Boston attorney who had seen all of this clearly and had been destroyed before he could present it. She looked up from the papers. She looked at Reginald Marsh sitting behind his attorneys with the stillness of a man who has recognized something dangerous and is calculating his options. He looked back at her. He knew exactly who she was. He had known since the moment she walked into that courtroom and possibly for some time before that. She held his gaze for one deliberate, measured moment. Then she returned her attention to Judge Whitmore. The documentary foundation of Silver Crown Mining Company's claim to the Quinn property is materially fraudulent, she said. The Quinn title is sound and should be affirmed without condition. I further request that the evidence of forged documentation in this case and in the adjacent California and Oregon cases be referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for full investigation. Judge Whitmore took 40 minutes. His ruling was complete and without qualification. The Quinn title was affirmed. The Silver Crown petition was dismissed with prejudice. The matter of the forged notarial documentation was referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation. Marsh's attorneys packed their materials with the careful movements of men performing a dignified retreat from a position that is no longer defensible. Marsh himself stood and walked out of the Elko Territorial Courtroom without looking at Eleanor or at any of the Quinn brothers. He walked through the courtroom doors and out into the November street, and Eleanor watched him go and thought, there it is, Father. There it finally is. Silas lifted her off the courtroom floor and turned her in a half circle in the middle of the public gallery, which was not appropriate courthouse behavior, and which Silas accomplished with a cheerful absence of concern for appropriate courthouse behavior that was among his most consistent qualities. Wade took her hand. He held it for a moment with a firmness that said everything he was not going to say out loud. Then he pulled her briefly and slightly awkwardly against his chest, in the way of a man who has decided that a handshake is insufficient and does not have a great deal of experience with the alternatives. It lasted approximately 4 seconds and conveyed more than an hour of conversation would have managed. Caleb waited until his brothers had moved away through the dispersing crowd. Then he came to her and took both her hands in his, and his grip was exactly as it always was, careful, certain, the hands of a man who understood the weight of things worth keeping. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly. She held on to this for a moment, held on to him. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. I think he finally would be. The weeks following the hearing settled the Quinn Ranch into a peace that felt different from any peace it had known before. More solid, more earned. Silver Crown went entirely quiet. The investigation being conducted by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office was real, and Marsh was cautious, and the ranchers and homesteaders who had already sold under pressure were beginning to receive official inquiries about the circumstances of those transactions. It would take time. Law always took time. But it was moving in the right direction, and it was moving because of what Eleanor had built and what her father had begun. When the investigation's findings eventually reached the courts in subsequent months, Clement Hatch Silver Crown's local agent in Elko was among those who faced questioning. The network Marsh had constructed across Nevada territory came apart piece by piece in the cold light of official scrutiny. He relocated his operations to another territory and found in the years that followed that the pattern he had used so successfully for so long was increasingly difficult to maintain as documentation of it spread through legal circles. The remaining winter preparations proceeded. The stores were sound, the house was ready for cold weather. And Caleb Quinn, with the same patient, thorough, unhurried determination he brought to everything that mattered to him, courted Eleanor Whitfield. He brought her wildflowers from the hillside, the last ones before the frost killed them, leaving small bunches of them on the kitchen table in the mornings without ceremony or explanation. He asked her questions about her father's books and listened to the answers with the complete quality of his attention that she had spent months understanding was not a small thing. He rode with her in the evenings when the weather permitted, teaching her the land with the same patience Silas brought to horses, showing her the marks of seasons past and the evidence of the ranch's long history in this valley. He told her things about himself in small pieces and in his own time, dismantling the drawn curtains one at a time, placing what was behind each one into the shared space between them with the care of someone who understands that trust is a thing built slowly and cannot be hurried without being broken. He made her laugh 3 times before she was ready for it. The third time they were at the kitchen table in the morning, and it arrived so suddenly and completely that she knocked her coffee cup and his hand caught it before it fell, and they were both leaning across the table looking at each other from a distance of approximately 8 inches, and the laughter subsided into something quieter and more serious, and she looked away first. Her hands went to the pins in her hair without her deciding to move them. On a cold December evening with the first real snow of the winter, laying itself quietly across the valley, Caleb asked Eleanor to sit with him on the porch after supper. They sat with blankets over their laps and the kind of silence between them that had become over months the most comfortable silence either of them knew. "I am not good at this," Caleb began. "I should say that first so that you will not be surprised by the quality of execution." "I am aware," she said. "Go on." He was quiet for a moment, and then he began. He told her that when his mother had asked him to find a wife, it had been obligation, a practical matter, an attempt to honor a dying woman's last wish, and nothing beyond that. He had believed himself too old and too much of what he was to offer anyone a genuine partnership. And then she had arrived, and she had not been what he expected on any single day, since in any direction or dimension he might have anticipated. "You are the first person in my adult life," he said, "who has looked at everything I am, the war and the mountains and the silences and all the rest of it, and made me feel that it might be sufficient, not in spite of my history, simply as I am." He looked at her with those amber eyes that she now knew as well as she knew anything. "I want to marry you, not because of any arrangement, not because it is practical, because I want to spend the rest of my life near you, and every day you are here I understand more clearly why I came back from the mountains. I came back to find something worth staying for." A pause. "Will you have me?" Eleanor looked at him. This man who carried a decade of weight with steady honesty, who had sold his 3 best horses to give her the freedom to leave, and then quietly accepted that she would not, who filled the wood box before she noticed it was empty, and kept his word in everything and spoke little and meant every word he said. She thought about her mother. She thought about 7 years of pins. She thought about what her mother had actually wanted for her underneath the armor and the instruction to survive. What Margaret Whitfield had wanted was for her daughter to have the life she herself had not been given. The life where a woman is seen, known, valued in the full complicated truth of herself. "Obviously," Inner said, and then because she was Thomas Whitfield's daughter and precision mattered, yes, all of it, obviously yes. The smile when it came was complete and unguarded and transformed his whole face into something she had suspected was there and had never yet seen clearly. Something almost young in its quality. The face of the man he had been before the mountains and the war had settled their permanent weight onto him. She thought, there it is. That is what was behind the curtains. He kissed her gently and she kissed him back with nothing held in reserve, and the snow fell outside and the mountains stood in their white patience, and the Quinn Ranch held them both in its earned and solid warmth. They were married 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning in December, most alone and perfectly clear, in the small church at the end of Elko's Main Street. The ceremony was brief and traditional, and witnessed by Silas, who served as the best man, and delivered a toast at the small reception afterward that ran to 11 minutes and included 4 separate stories and required gentle intervention. Wade stood with the ramrod posture of a man who has decided that complete physical stillness is the correct response to the magnitude of what he is feeling. Silas's trapper friend Morris attended a weathered, taciturn man who shook Eleanor's hand with the expression of someone reassessing a situation he had previously considered settled. Agnes from the trading post came with her husband and brought a pie that was better than anything Eleanor had yet managed, which Agnes accepted as a compliment with the serenity of a woman who has known this about herself for years. Eleanor wore deep blue wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs made over 6 weeks of early mornings in the hour before the ranch woke up. Caleb wore his best dark jacket and looked, she noted, with the private amusement that was becoming one of her favorite small pleasures, precisely as nervous as she had ever seen a man look. This enormous, weathered, steady man who had faced more genuine danger than most people would encounter in 3 lifetimes was anxious about getting married, and she found this both deeply endearing and in a way she did not examine too carefully or reassuring. They spoke their vows in clear voices. They meant every word of them. That evening, the ranch house was quiet in the way it is quiet when it has been left deliberately to 2 people who have just made each other a permanent promise. Silas had engineered his own absence with the cheerful transparency of a man who wants credit for his thoughtfulness. Wade had gone with him, and it was the only thing Wade had done all day without any apparent difficulty. Eleanor stood in the bedroom doorway. Caleb stood by the window. The lamp was lit, and the fire was burning, and the snow was coming down outside in the steady, unhurried way of snow that has settled in for the night. "Are you all right?" he asked. He always asked. She had come to understand this question as the primary language of his love. "I see you. I am paying attention. Nothing you feel is too small to matter." "Nervous," she said, "and very happy, both at once, which is a stranger combination than I expected." He began to say something quiet and careful and considerate, the thing he always said when he wanted her to know that nothing was required of her that she did not freely choose. "Caleb," she said, stopping him gently. "I know." She looked at him. "I want to show you something." She reached up. Her fingers found the first pin. He went very still across the room. She took the pins out one at a time, deliberately, each one a choice made, with her eyes open and her hands steady. 7 pins. 7 years. She placed each one on the small dresser beside her, and in the quiet room the sound of each one touching the wood was clear and unhurried. A promise kept, and a promise made new. Her hair came down. She had not worn it loose in 7 years. The feeling of it, the weight of it falling past her shoulders, the warmth of it, the strange and complete freedom of it, was disorienting for one moment, and then simply overwhelmingly right. She stood in the lamplight with her honey blonde hair loose around her and felt the last of the armor come away, and what was underneath it was not softness and was not weakness. What was underneath it was something she had not had a name for until this exact moment, trust so complete, it required no protection. Caleb looked at her across the small room, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for without fully understanding that he was waiting. "My mother asked me to keep it up," Eleanor said quietly, "until a man had truly earned the right to see it down." She met his eyes. "You earned it a long time ago. I only needed time to understand it." He crossed the room and his hands were in her hair, moving through the long strands with a gentleness that understood exactly what this had cost and exactly what it was worth. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "Thank you," she said, "for being worth trusting." The door closed softly. Outside, the Nevada snow came down in silence, and the mountains stood in the dark in their permanent white patience, and the Quinn Ranch held its warmth against the cold, the way things hold warmth when they have been built with care and lived in with intention. In the morning, everything was different, and everything was exactly what it should have been. The Quinn Valley filled in the way that things fill in when given the right conditions and the right people and the right amount of time, gradually, and then completely. Silver Crown Mining Company never returned to Elko County. Thomas Whitfield's files submitted into the public record through the Elko hearing were cited in 2 subsequent cases in other jurisdictions. Eleanor learned this from Pemberton in a letter the following spring, and she read it standing at the kitchen window with the morning light coming in and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was still held. She went to the small writing table in the corner of the parlor. She opened Blackstone's commentaries to the page where she had tucked the folded paper with her father's name written on it. She took the paper out. She held it for a moment. Then she placed it carefully between the back pages of the book, which was, she decided, the right place for it. Not discarded, not displayed. Simply held the way all finished things deserve to be held. Silas Quinn remained at the ranch and remained himself, which was exactly what the ranch needed him to be. He was better with horses in the second year than he had been in the first, which was saying something considerable. And the reputation of the Quinn horses began to reach neighboring ranches and then ranches farther afield. He was the heart of that place in the way that certain people are the hearts of the places they belong to, invisibly and completely, and in a way that only becomes fully apparent when you imagine the alternative. Wade Quinn met a woman named Louise in the spring of the following year, a school teacher from Denver who was passing through Elko on her way further west and reconsidered the destination when she stopped for supplies and encountered Wade in the dry goods store. She was small and precise and regarded his considerable physical presence with calm, assessing interest that suggested she found him more interesting than intimidating, which was not a response Wade had previously encountered. He was so entirely unprepared for this that he fell in love with a completeness and an absence of defense that he had never once permitted himself in any other context, and the bewilderment of it was visible on his face for weeks. They married in the spring at the Quinn Ranch, and the ceremony was warm and brief and dignified, and afterward, Silas gave a toast that was only 8 minutes long, which everyone agreed represented real personal growth. Eleanor and Caleb built what they had promised each other. The first child came 18 months after the wedding, a daughter with her father's amber eyes and her mother's honey-colored hair, who arrived in the world with the focused intensity of someone who has decided to take everything seriously from the beginning. They named her Margaret after Eleanor's mother. Caleb made the cradle himself, carved carefully over 3 weeks of winter evenings, while Eleanor read aloud from her father's books, and Margaret slept in it in the small room off the main bedroom, and woke at hours that appeared specifically designed to test the outer limits of adult endurance. And both her parents took turns walking the floor in the small hours of Nevada nights, and were, despite everything, unreasonably happy. After Margaret came Thomas, named for Eleanor's father, dark and quick, and possessed of a quality of attention that reminded Eleanor so strongly of her father in his best years that she sometimes looked at him and had to look away for a moment. Then James, then a second daughter they named Helen for Caleb's mother. The cabin grew with the family, a new wing, a proper porch that Eleanor filled in summer with whatever flowers she could persuade the Nevada soil to produce. The kitchen garden started from nothing in the spring of 1879, with Eleanor's hands and knees in the dirt, had by the end of the decade become something that visitors stopped to look at, terraced and organized and producing things that had no business growing at that altitude in that soil, as though the stubbornness with which it had been established had somehow transferred itself to the earth. The years moved through the valley in the rhythm of honest work and honest seasons. They were not easy years, not all of them. There were hard winters and failed crops and the ordinary losses that find every family, eventually the things that cannot be prevented and can only be survived together, which they did. There were also evenings on the porch when the mountains did the impossible thing they did at that hour with the light, and the children were playing in the meadow below, and Caleb's hand was on hers, and neither of them needed to say anything, because everything that needed to be said had long since been said and was now simply lived. Their children grew up knowing the land the way their parents had learned it from the ground up and the inside out, understanding it as a thing that had to be worked with honestly and could not be managed from a distance. Margaret inherited her mother's precise intelligence and her father's steadiness, and became in time a woman who made things work through the application of thought and patience and refused to accept that things could not be improved. Thomas went to San Francisco to study law, the only Quinn child who left the valley for formal education and came back to Nevada to practice it, and argued his first territorial case in the same Elko courtroom where his mother had argued hers, which Eleanor learned about from a letter and did not mention to Thomas because he was uncomfortable with sentiment, but which she kept in the back of Blackstone's commentaries alongside the other things she held there. James became a rancher and expanded the Quinn land holdings further up the valley. Helen taught school for 20 years in the small schoolhouse that had been built in the valley when enough families had settled nearby to make it necessary, and ran it with a combination of warmth and precision that Eleanor recognized without surprise. The seasons passed. The hair that Eleanor had kept so carefully pinned for 7 years before that December night had gone silver at the temples, and then throughout, and she wore it however suited her, now braided or loose or pinned as the day required, without any of it meaning what it had once meant. It had been a promise in an armor, in a choice, and then it had become something else, simply her hair worn freely in the life that had turned out to be worth the long and unlikely journey to arrive at it. On a spring evening, when the wildflowers were thick in the meadow, and the aspens were putting out new leaves in that yellow-green that only lasts a week before it deepens into summer, Eleanor sat on the porch and watched her grandchildren in the grass below. Margaret's two boys were doing something competitive and physical that might have been racing and might have been fighting and was possibly both. Helen's daughters were sitting in a patient row teaching each other something that required serious concentration and small, precise movements. James's youngest was simply lying on his back in the wildflowers, looking at the sky, which Eleanor privately considered the best use of a spring evening. Caleb came out and sat beside her the way he had been sitting beside her for more than 30 years now, with the ease of people who have occupied the same space so long that the space has taken the shape of them. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "About how my mother was right," she said. "She told me to go somewhere they would see me. She meant the intelligence and the capability she always knew I had that Boston had never made room for." She was quiet for a moment. "But I think she also meant something else she did not know she meant. I think she meant go somewhere you will let yourself be seen." Caleb took her hand. His hand was slower than it had been, the joints stiffer in cold weather, but the certainty of it was unchanged. "Was it worth it?" he said. "All of it. The risk of trusting." She turned and looked at him, this silver-haired, weather-worn man who had been behind the drawn curtains all along, who had sold his best horses so she could choose freely, who had walked porch floors in the small hours of too many nights, carrying things he had finally learned to set down, who had asked her once what she wanted and then spent 3 decades building it alongside her. "Every single day," she said. He kissed her as the sun went behind the mountains, and the grandchildren called to each other in the meadow, and the valley held all of it in its long, permanent, unhurried peace. Eleanor Grace Whitfield. Quinn died on a morning in early spring in the room she had shared with Caleb for decades, with her children around her and the sound of the creek coming through the open window. Her hair was loose on the pillow, silver and still thick, and her last words were a whisper too quiet for anyone to fully catch, though Margaret, who was closest, believed she heard the name spoken. They buried her beside Caleb, who had gone 3 years before, in the corner of the high meadow, where the wildflowers came up every spring without fail, where the view of the valley was clear in every direction, and the mountains stood their eternal watch. The stone they placed was simple and said what needed to be said, their names, their years, and below that, in the careful lettering that James had insisted on himself, "Built this with our own hands." The cabin still stands, the garden still produces, tended now by hands 3 generations removed from the woman who first cleared it of weeds, with her knees in the dirt and her sleeves rolled and her determination in plain sight. The valley still bears the Quinn name. And on spring evenings, when the light does what it does at that hour over the Nevada mountains, people who know the story say you can still feel the peace that was made there. Not given, not inherited, made from hard choices and honest work, and the courage it takes to trust something you cannot yet see clearly. The courage of letting your hair down in a room with someone who has earned it. The courage of staying when you finally have the freedom to go. The courage, above all, of choosing the life that is actually in front of you with both hands open without condition.